This week is Parshat Vayetze, and we continue on learning Yaakov Avinu. And at the beginning of the Parsha, Vayivka b'mukam v'yolen sham. Mikan sheYaakov tikein tfilas arvis. As the Gemara says in Brochas Chova Midbeis, Tfilos Avois Tiknum. Avram Avinu was matakan tfilas shachris, v'yashkem Avram b'boikram. Yitzchak tfilas mincha. Vayetze Yitzchak lasuach besoda. And Yaakov Avinu finally was matakan tfilas arvis. Vayivka b'mokom ein b'gia ela loshin tfilo. In that same Gemara Brochas Chova Midbeis we learn tfilas kereged karbonos tiknum. The three tfilas coincide with karbonos. Shachris, Tomit shel Shachar, Minche Tomit shel Beinu Arbayim, Arvis, Keneged Eivorim v'Bidorim shenishtayeru. So parts of the karbonos that we put on the Mizbeach, they were left over, even though there is no korban that we bring balaylo. All the karbonos are brought by day, not by night. But those leftovers, those eivarim, those parts of the korban could be put on the mizbech even by night, and that's tfilas arvis. And that is why tfilas arvis rishus, because the tmidim, korban tumet, shachris, v'beinu arbayim, are obligatory, but not the eivarim ebidorim. So our topic today is tfilas arvis rishus, the concept of קיבלו, עליהם, חובה, which is a fascinating concept. And our shiur today is one of those broad-based shiurim. And the structure is very clear. I will bring 10 sources in which we find קיבלו, עליהם, חובה. That a person could obligate himself to perform mitzvahs that by their very nature are voluntary. They're not a chiyuv. But if a person could take upon himself and transform a voluntary mitzvah to become a mandatory one, a chiyuv, reshus becomes a chiyuv, קיבלו, עליהם, חובה. I will bring 10 sources and then 4 ways to understand this then. How? How is it within one's power to turn a reshus into a chiyuv? And I will suggest 4 sources, maybe from Shas, Bavli, and Yerushalmi, because the 10 sources are all from Rishonim and Achronim. So let's embark on our beautiful, wonderful journey. Tfilas arvis reshus o chayva. That was a huge controversy in the days of the greatest Tanoim. Brochas Chav Zayin Amid Beis. Rabbi Gamliel, the Nosi, maintained tfilas arvis chayva. Rabbi Yeshua ben Chananya, the great Anav, and one of the greatest Tanoim, one of the great Talmidim of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai and Rabbi Eliezer ben Horkanos, he says tfilas arvis reshus. And the Gemara tells the story. Rabbi Gamliel was the Nosi, he said chayva. And somebody told him, you know, Rabbi Yeshua disputes your opinion, and he says it's reshus. And he was somewhat angered. So the next day in Beis Medrash, Rabbi Gamliel teaches Torah. Rabbi Yeshua sits there between the olam, and he says, tfilas arvis chayva. Does anybody disagree with me? No one disagreed. No one spoke up. Rabbi Gamliel turns to Rabbi Yeshua. What do you think about tfilas arvis? He says reshus. But I was told that you darshan it's a chayva. And Rabbi Yeshua is taken aback, and he says, I can't deny it. I do think it's a reshus. They don't want to say it in your presence, but I think it's a reshus. And Rabbi Gamliel says, Amoid al raglecha. And Rabbi Yeshua is standing. He doesn't sit down, because Rabbi Gamliel didn't let him sit down. And Rabbi Gamliel darshans and darshans and darshans, and it takes long. And the Chachmei Beis Medrash were hurt and embarrassed for Rabbi Yeshua. Why is he doing this? And they whispered to Chutzpes HaMeturgamin, stop the drosha. And they decided to banish Rabbi Gamliel from the Nasius and to appoint another Nasi. Who were the ones that decided to do so? Rabbi Kiva ben Yosef, Rabbi Loza ben Azariah, and they decided to appoint Rabbi Loza ben Azariah to be the Nasi instead of Rabbi Gamliel. They couldn't push aside Rabbi Gamliel, so they said 2 weeks he and 2 weeks he. Rabbi Gamliel apologized, and he got the Nasius back. So it's an amazing story. Maybe in another opportunity I will elaborate on the story, but that's not our sugya today. And that was decided in the days of the Amiroim. Rav says, the Rambam in 3 different sources in Ilchas Tefillah, Paskins Tefillas Havas Rishus, Perek Aleph, Perek Gimel, and Perek Tes. Shulchan Aruch, Reish Lamed Hey, Reish Lamed Vav, Reish Lamed Zayin, Tefillas Havas Rishus. However, this is a huge problem, because 2 sugyas in the Gemara seems to totally reject the opinion Tefillas Havas Rishus. And those 2 sugyas are Daf Chof and Daf Lamed and Mesechet Brochos. Everybody knows if you forgot to say Yala v'Yover Rosh Chodesh by day, you need to daven again. But by night, you don't need to do so. And why is that? Ein mekatchen es Chodesh b'laylo. But if Tfilas Arabis essentially is a Rishus, how could there be a Chiyuv to daven again if there never was a Chiyuv to daven in the first place? So why is it only because Ein mekatchen es Chodesh b'laylo do we say you don't have to re-daven? How could there be a chayva to daven again if there never was a chayva to daven in the first place? So this Gemara seems to indicate clearly that there is a chayva to daven. And the other sugya is, if you forgot Marav, you daven Teshlumin, you daven 2 Shmoin Esses in the morning by Shachris. How could there be Teshlumin if there never was a chiyuv? And that is why the Rishonim must come up with an explanation. Tosfos twice in Mesechet Brochos. Chavav Amud Aleph and Chav Zayin Amud Beis. Tosfos says, even though the Rosh of the Gemara is Tefillas Havas Rishus, it's not totally a Rishus. It's not in Ganzen a Rishus. It's a Rishus compared to a Chayva. Aval ein levatlo bechinam. You can't just not daven without any real reason. Tefillas Havas just means if there's an other mitzvah averes, it overrides and pushes aside Tefillas Havas. But if there's no other mitzvah you need to perform and be mekayim, then you need to daven. Tosfos is a shtickle doichik, because after all, the lashon of the Gemara is Tefillas Havas Rishus. There are another 2 Tosfosim, not in Brochos, but rather in Mesechet Yuma Peizayin Amud Beis and Mesechet Chagiga Tes Amud Beis. Tosfos quotes the Bahag, the Halachos Gedolos, one of the Gaonim. Tefillas Havas, in essence, is a Rishus, is voluntary. Aval קיבלו עליהם חובה. We were mekabel the Rishus, and it becomes a chayva. In 2 ways, קיבלו עליהם חובה. And those 2 different methodologies, those 2 different ways, coincide with the 2 Gemaras I quoted, which seem to prove it's a chayva and not a Rishus. So when you davened Marav and you forgot Yala v'Yavai, you took upon yourself to daven Marav because you did. You davened. So because he davened, that is Kibul Olav Chayva. But how about the case in which I forgot to daven entirely? So I didn't daven tonight, but you davened yesterday. And you davened the day before yesterday, and last week, and last month, and last year. You've been davening for all these years. That is the קיבלו עליהם חובה. And both are in Tosfos b'Shem Halachos Gedolos. But the Rif and the Rambam have a totally different interpretation of קיבלו עליהם חובה. And the Rif starts off with Halachos Gedolos. And the Rif says, he davened tonight, and he intended to daven, and therefore Kibul Olav Chayva. But then the Rif goes on to say, Kibul Olav Chayva, Klal Yisrael. Not a personal obligation, but a collective one. So we all have been davening for ages, 3 tefillas every day, Shachris Mincha Marav. So obviously, Klal Yisrael took upon itself to daven Marav, and that is the קיבלו עליהם חובה. Not a personal one, but a communal one. Not each individual, but the Klal. So the Rif and the Rambam stress the Kabbalah Klolis, the general Kabbalah, while the Halachas Gedolos quoted by Tosfos and many other Rishonim stress the personal one. So the very first source that we find קיבלו עליהם חובה is the discussion regarding Tfilas Arvis. Rishus, however, קיבלו עליהם חובה, either the personal level or in the communal level. Either the individual, by davening tonight, by davening yesterday and the day before yesterday, or the entire people. We've all been davening for thousands of years. Marav as well as Shachas and Mincha, and that is קיבלו עליהם חובה. That's number one. I promised 10 sources. Number two, Ala Nisim and Purim. So the halacha is if you skipped Ala Nisim and Purim, you don't need to re-daven. You don't need to daven again. That is the opinion of most of the Rishonim, but the Beis Yosef quotes the Raviyah. Mesechet Megillah Tov Kuf Samach Gimel. The Raviyah is quoted by the Mordechai. Mesechet Megillah Reish Ayin Tet. The Raviyah says, קיבלו עליהם חובה. And therefore, you skipped Ala Nisim, Chanukah, Purim, you need to daven again. Ein halacha kedivrei Raviyah. But the Raviyah was one of the great Rishonim. And what is his logic? What's his argument? קיבלו עליהם חובה. Number three is similar to number two. If you forgot to say Ritzei by Shalashudis, if you forgot to say Ritzei Shabbos, Leil Shabbos, Yom Shabbos, you need to bench again. Shalashudis is a machloikis, and why is that? Because according to many Rishonim, and this opinion is also brought in Shulchan Aruch, you could be Yotze Shalashos with cake, with mezonos, even with peiros. So there is no chiyuv to bench. If there's no chiyuv to bench in the first place, there's no chiyuv to bench again. And therefore, according to the Raviyah, once again, this is the opinion of the Raviyah. If you forgot Ritzei by Shalashudis, you need to bench again. Even though many other Rishonim paskin, no, it's not a chayva. But the Raviyah says, קיבלו עליהם חובה. And the Raviyah is once again quoted in the Beis Yosef in Kuf Pei Ches in Hilchas Shabbos. Number four, Malchu Yosef Chroinoi Shofros takes us all the way to Hilchas Rosh Hashanah Tov Kuf Tzadik Aleph. So Malchi and Chroinoi Shofros are essentially brochos. Tkiyas Shofar is on the Seder of Malchi and Chroinoi Shofros. But in Rosh Hashanah we learn there are also 10 psukim that we say. The psukim are not a chiyuv. It's a reshus. And if you skip the psukim, you still were yoytze. However, the Magen Avraham, Tav Kuf Tzadik Aleph, Sif Kot Vav says, קיבלו עליהם חובה. It's no longer a reshus. You need to say each and every one of those brachas. Another source for קיבלו עליהם חובה. Number five starts to become fascinating and interesting. The Magen Avraham Tov Pei Tes Sif Koten Aleph says, Noshim קיבלו עליהם חובה ספיras u'oima. And why is this a chiddush? Because usually Bnei Ashkenaz paskin in accordance to the Magen Avraham, but in this case, ein halacha k'moisei. In most kehilos Yisrael, by Artzos Ashkenaz, Noshim weren't makpid to say Sfiras u'oima. Even the Mishnah Berurah says if a woman wants to count Sfiras u'oima, she should count without a bracha. According to the Magen Avraham, it's a chiyuv gamur, קיבלו עליהם חובה. Two of the great Achronim disagree with the Magen Avraham, Nazir Shimshon on the spot of Peites and the Mechas Chinuch Shin Vav, and they argue קיבלו עליהם חובה doesn't work. It's not relevant only when there's a machloikis. So an individual or the tzibur could be makabel lahachmir kedas machmirim, but if there's no opinion that it's a chayva, then קיבלו עליהם חובה doesn't make sense. Really? Many of the sources I will quote today, and some of the ones I already quoted, is not b'mokar machlokes. I would add on to the disagreement, to the achronim that go against the Magen Avraham. I would say קיבלו עליהם חובה shaykh be'echad mishnei ponim, one out of two cases. Either when it's a machlokes, or when everybody agrees is a mitzvah l'chatchila. So the l'chatchila is ma'akev b'di'eved. You could turn a reshus into a chayva, but only when this reshus is not a total reshus. Everybody agrees a mitzvah l'chatchila. Like the 10 psukim of Malchi Zechron and Shoifrois. It's in the Mishnah and the Gemara. Everybody agrees l'chatchila you need to say those psukim. Shalashudis l'chatchila you should wash, even though you're yoitz if you don't wash. But nobody says that Noshim have a mitzvah l'chatchila to count Svias Oimer. It's just like any other mitzvah say Shazman Grama. So the Magen Avraham is still a Chiddush. Because on one hand, there's no machlokes. On the other hand, there also is no l'chatchila. So it's easier to understand that a mitzvah l'chatchila is mi'akav b'di'evet קיבלו עליהם חובה, but not when there is no mitzvah l'chatchila. However, the Magen Avraham maintains, even by Svias Oimer, no chiyuv l'chatchila. No opinion that says no Shomar Chayev. And I'm discounting the Ramban and Kedushin Lamed Daled, but that's a sugya b'fnei atzmai. Nevertheless, according to Magen Avraham, קיבלו עליהם חובה. And Rabbi Akiva Eiger doesn't quote the Magen Avraham, but he follows in his footsteps. Tshuvas Rabbi Akiva Eiger Siman Aleph, not in the tshuva, but rather in the Mafteches and the Hashmotas B'Sof HaSefer. Rabbi Akiva Eiger says, Afal Pisha Shoifar, Lulav, Sukkah are all mitzvah shazman grama. Rabbi Akiva says, קיבלו עליהם חובה. And therefore, Noshim have a chiyuv to hear Shoifar, to be noit Lulav, Sukkah as well. That would be strange. There are different tfusim, different printings, different publications of Rabbi Akiva Eiger, and some of them, Rabbi Akiva Eiger beferush writes, Noshim Archayev, Shoifar, Lulav, Sukkah. Some of the publications, they took Sukkah out. Interesting. I don't know which is the right one from Rabbi Akiva Eiger's perspective. So the Magen Avraham deals with one mitzvah shazman groma, and that is Svias Oimer. Rabbi Akiva Eiger broadens the scope, all of them. There's a raya to Rabbi Akiva Eiger from a Psumim Roish. So let me say something a bit amusing. The Shittas Rabbi Akiva Eiger, there's a raya to Rabbi Akiva Eiger. What do I mean to say? Psumim Roish is an extremely questionable sefer. Rav Mordechai Bennett, Amenenikal of Rav Mordechai Bennett, came out very harsh against the sefer. Was printed in his days. And he writes, not only is it not authentic, not only is it a ziyuf, a forgery, ruach minus nizraku boy. And he says, you can't have the sefer at home. Al tishken bo'olcha avlo. Es chatoy ani maskerei, I have the Psumim Roish. How do I dare? You're an Einikel of Rav Mordechai Bennett, because Rabbi Akiva Eiger quotes him several different places. Or Chaim Kuvov, Rabbi Akiva Eiger quotes the Psumim Roish. And to me, it's just a historical curios. Today we know far more than we knew then. The Sefer has no authenticity. It's a total bluff. It's a total fake. But nevertheless, it's an interesting historical document, so I have it at home. So, the Shittas Rabbi Akiva Eiger, that was machshav the Sefer, and he quotes him, so Rabbi Akiva Eiger says, Alayim Psumim Rosh, Psumim Rosh Peites, Psumim Rosh writes, Noshim Mur Kabel Atzmam, Shoifar, Sukkah, V'kol HaMitzvahs. And he broadens the scope, the entire spectrum of mitzvahs asay shazman grama. So what do we have? Tfilas Arvis, Ala Nisim, Retzei B'Shabbos, Svias Oimer, Mitzvahs Asay, Shazman Grama. And we continue on our journey. I also quoted Malchi Zechron and Shoifros. So we're up to number 7. An interesting comment in Ilchas Chanukah. We are already in the midst of Chodesh Kislev, so we could start talking about Chanukah. We all remember the Gemara Shabbos Chof Aleph. Mitzvahs Chanukah Neresh Beisoy. HaMahadrin. Nela Kol Echad V'Echad. Mahadrin Min HaMahadrin. Moise v'hoilach, Poise v'hoilach. The Rambam, Hilchos Chanukah, quotes all three options. Nerish Beisoi, Nera kol echad v'yechad, Moise v'hoilach. But the Shulchan Aruch doesn't do so. Tofresh Ayin Aleph Siv Beis, Shulchan Aruch says, you need to be madlik, Nera kol ner Moise v'hoilach, from day to day. So the Shulchan Aruch brings only Mahadrim and a Mahadrim. He totally ignores the option of Nerish Beisoi. The Noise Kalim don't even discuss this question. The Magen Avraham, the Taz, some later Achronim do. In my opinion, according to the Shulchan Aruch, קיבלו עליהם חובה. Not the personal level, but the communal level. So obviously, since the days of the Rishonim, mechibuv mitzvah, because this is such a beautiful mitzvah which we so highly cherish once a year, and it's about Pirsum and Nisa, Yoidu Lashem Chazda v'nifloisav l'vnei Adam, and therefore קיבלו עליהם חובה. And Nerish Beisoi is no longer relevant, because it's a chayva to be Moise v'hoilach. That is my understanding, solving this dilemma. And if you want to further learn this sugya, Minchas Osha Moyadem Chelik Beis Siman Hey. Number 8 brings us back to the Ravya, and this is Ravya number 3 that I'm quoting today regarding קיבלו עליהם חובה. Taisus Shabbos Chofei Amid Beis seems to be misupek whether we say Abrocha and Adlokas Ner Chanukah. What's the suffix? Imotzu doluk einoi doilek, einoi madlik. So Ner Chanukah is all about the result. You shouldn't be sitting in the dark. And therefore Ner Chanukah is Shalom Bayis, Kvoid Shabbos, Oinig Shabbos. So Ner Chanukah, if there's a light in the house, then you put it from Adlokas Ner Chanukah. And therefore, some Rishonim maintain you don't say a brocha Ner Chanukah, because it's not a mitzvah lahadlik. The mitzvah is not to be sitting in the dark. However, Ravya Shabbos Kuf Tzadik Tes writes, קיבלו עליהם חובה. Noshim tzidkonius, Neshois Yisrael קיבלו עליהם חובה. Even if there is an erdolak, you put out that fire, you put out that candle, and you light a new one. קיבלו עליהם חובה, and that is why we say Abrocha on Ner Shabbos. So an additional source, number 8 on our list, number 3, Mitoires HaRavya. Make it a din, if the house is light, you don't have to light Ner Shabbos. The ikar is not sitting in the dark. קיבלו עליהם חובה. We extinguish the light and we put it on again. And that is another source of קיבלו עליהם חובה. So the Shulchan Aruch says in Sif Aleph, Siman Aleph, Shulchan Aruch Orach Chaim, it's a minhag tov to say the korbanos every day. And why is it important? Because kol oiseh b'tois chatas, kilu ikrav chatas, oilu b'tois oilu, kilu ikrav oilo, kilu akrivu kol korbanos. But it's a minhag. Siman Memches stands apart. Siman Aleph thinks about all the other korbanos. Memches, Shulchan Aruch writes, one should say Parshas HaTomid every day. So in Siman Aleph it's Nahagu. Siman Memches Oimrim. Shulchan Aruch Harav differentiates between the two. And he says, saying all the korbanos is just a minhag, and therefore if you're a lamdan, if you're a masmed, it would be preferable to learn Torah. But Siman Memches says, קיבלו עליהם חובה, and saying Parshas HaTomid is obligatory. It's a chayva, and not only a rishus. So I quoted 9 different sources. Atzad HaShovish Shebehem, the common denominator, they're all Shulchan Aruch Orach Chaim. Source number 10 is Yoredeya. Are tzipronayim choitzitz b'tfila? Definitely not. What is ma'akav is, you need to clean your fingernails. But if they're clean, they're not choitzitz. Chachma Sodom, who was naturally the Chayodom, Kuf Yutet Sif Yudalet says, קיבלו עליהם חובה, to cut your nails before tefillah, and it's a chiyuv to the extent, if you didn't do so, you need a new tefillah. According to the Chochmas Sodom, קיבלו עליהם חובה. I need to apologize in the middle of this shiur because I forgot to mention that today's shiur is dedicated Le'ilui Nishmosoi of Reb Mordechai ben Reb Yeshua Menachem Mendel, the father of my dear friend and Talmud, Harav Eddie Weber, teaches Torah and Etzisol Baruch Hashem. Reb Mordechai was a wonderful Jew, a professional that dedicated every spare moment to learning. He loved to learn. And I came to know the Weber family many years ago when I used to come and visit Teaneck, New Jersey. Eli left his business as a prominent partner in a very prestigious law firm. He moved to Etzisol to teach Torah, to learn and to teach. What a move, what an inspiration to all his Talmidim. And his father came some years later. Every Thursday night, I was so moved to see 3 generations. Kol shu Talmud Chochem ve'beno Talmud Chochem ve'ben beno Talmud Chochem. Shuven HaTorah Posekes Mezaroi. And they used to come from Efrat every Thursday night to my Shiur in Ramot. Tomorrow is the Yortzeit. So the Torah we learned today, Le'ilu Nishmos of Reb Mordechai ben Yeshua Heschel Mendel, She'anuach b'sholom ha'mishkavai. The Torah we learn should be Le'ilu Nishmos, and he should be a Meretz Yosef for his outstanding, wonderful, beautiful family. We continue. So I brought 10 sources, קיבלו עליהם חובה, but how does it work? What is the logic? What's the svara? What power do we have to turn a reshus into a chayva? I want to offer 4 different interpretations, going back to the 2 different concepts, Kabbalah Protis and Kabbalah Klolis, the individual Kabbalah and the communal Kabbalah. So the individual Kabbalah could be defined as a neder, if you did it, especially if you did it more than once. It's like a minik shel mitzvah, which is considered a neder. And if it's a neder, bal yachal davora, kol yoytze mepiv yaseh, it's a neder. Ktsois HaChoshen. Lamed Daled Sif Koten Daled has a big vikuach with Maharibal, Mari Ben Lev. How do we define, how do we understand the doors in Kemei Edom Domi? How do we understand Shavya Anavshei Chaticha Desira? So the Ktsois brings earlier opinions. Hidos Baldin is a schayves. Shavya Anavshei is a neder. The Ktsois disagrees. And the Ktsois says no. Hidos Baldin and Shavya Anavshei are the same. Same concept, 2 sides of the same coin, and both are namonos. And I argue with the Ktsois HaChoshen on 2 different counts. Neither Shavya Nefshai nor Hidos Baldin is not namonos. And on the other hand, they have nothing to do one with another. I don't know why some Achronim think they come together. This is base of a heter, this is b'momenes, nothing to do one with another. So my understanding in Hidos Baldin that I wrote many times in my Sforim, Hidos Baldin is not a schayves, it's not an amonos, it's an assumption. And Shavya Nafshay, totally different concept, which I will explain right now. קיבלו עליהם חובה. I think it's far-fetched to say it's medin neder. What is it? Hein tzedek. Baba Metzia Mem Tes, the Gemara says, Shehen shel chut tzedek v'lav shel tzul tzedek. We need to practice what we preach. We need to keep promises. Even bein odam lechaveiroi. Matona meruba oso lachzor boy. We didn't do a kinyan, but you promised. And the Torah expects you to live up to your promises. Shehen shel chut tzedek v'lav shel chut tzedek. And I say, if this applies to ben odam lechaveiroi, kal v'choyme ben odam lemokoim. קיבלו עליהם חובה is a promise. A promise you gave to HaKadosh Baruch Hu should be kept. And that is קיבלו עליהם חובה. Whether it's personal, each individual, or Klal Yisrael. What we take upon ourselves, HaKadosh Baruch Hu expects us to stand in what we took upon ourselves. And that is also Shavya Nafshecha Ticha de Yisura. Shavya Nafshecha Ticha de Yisura is by Yisurim. Lo Ta'asa. קיבלו עליהם חובה is b'mitzvah say primarily. Besides Chatzitza B'tfilo, all the other sources we quoted from Shulchan Aruch HaChaim are all positive and not negative, all mitzvahs say. But they are both based on a yesod pashut b'yosa, the most simple understanding. What you promised to your fellow Jew, you need to be mekayim. Kal v'choyim, you need to be mekayim what you promised HaKadosh Baruch Hu. This is regarding the personal kibbul of chayva. How about Klal Yisrael's kibbul of chayva? Here I also suggest two different drachim. Maybe the Kabbalah of Klal is just Torah's a minhag. It's a minhag. And how do we know a minhag is valid? How do we know we need to be Makayim and Hogam? That's a Gemara twice in Shas. Psochim Nun Omid Beis regarding Hilchos Shabbos, Chulin Tzadi Gimel Omid Beis regarding Eva Menachai, Macholas Asuros. The Gemara quotes a posuk in Mishli. Al titoish Toiras imecha. Obviously, Shema B'nimos Avichu is Torah, Halacha. Al titoish Toiras imecha is minhag. Because in Beis Yisrael, usually the father is the one that teaches us Torah. Dalet Chelke Shechanoach, Halacha, he's the Talmud Chacham. But it's from your mother that you learn what do Jews do and what don't they do. How you should act and react and interact in your home. And that is Torah's minhag that Chazal based on Al Titosh Torah Semecha. So would that be the same as קיבלו עליהם חובה? Not the same, but related. And what I mean to say is this. Minhag is only a minhag. קיבלו עליהם חובה goes beyond the minhag. But it's based on Torah's minhag. And what I mean to say is this. Usually by minhagim, we had no intention of taking it upon ourselves as if it would be a chiyuv. It's not a chiyuv, but it's a minhag, but it is what we do. We do the minhag b'tor rishus, not b'tor chiyuv. However, when we are kavei minhag b'tor chiyuv, it is an additional level. And it has more harshness, more chumrah than a minhag b'tor rishus. But it boils down to minhag. And shoresh dvorim, fundamentally, it's hilchas minhagim. There are actually three dargas in minhag. When people have a minhag, which they mistakenly think is a chiyuv, is a halacha, then that minhag bears no meaning, no significance. It's a minhag tos. So what I want to say is this. When people have a minhag mistakenly thinking it's a chiyuv, that minhag is invalid. It's a minhag tos. When people have a minhag and they have no intention of turning it into a chiyuv, it's a minhag shereshos. You need to be mekayim. Al titesh Torah semechu. It's important, but it's not a chiyuv because they never meant it to be a chiyuv. But a minhag, we are aware that by din Torah it's not a chiyuv, but we want to take it upon ourselves as a chiyuv. That turns into a chiyuv. And that is the concept of קיבלו עליהם חובה. Another mahalach would be based on a gewaldige chiddush we find in Shuvas Arash, b'chelek Vov Reish Nun Daled, and in Shuvas Arash. Klal Vov, Siman Yutet Chof Chof Aleph. The Rash and the Rosh are not talking about menhogim, but rather about tkonois atzibur. When a tzibur is metaken tkonois. But what is negel in your name and what is important? The Rashba and the Rosh says, Tkonas HaTzibur is chayovim. It is obligatory. Because the tzibur has the authority of Bezdin Agodl Shebiyushalayim. Not a Bezdin of Shloisha. Not a Bezdin that has the authority to be done din Foshas Chov Gimel. The Bezdin Agodl that sits in Lishkas HaGozes and Beis HaMikdosh. Bezdin Shel Shimon V'Yachod Zekenim. That's the Koyach HaTzibur. So once again, the Rashba and the Rosh are dealing with a takona that the tzibur took upon himself. Shivatu ve'hakohol. We're dealing with קיבלו עליהם חובה, but maybe they have something in common. When it's a Kabbalah klolis of Klal Yisrael, of an entire tzibur, going for many years, that once again has utmost and total authority, like Beis Nagodl Shabi Yerushalayim. So these are the yesodis in which I understand the essence of קיבלו עליהם חובה. So I quoted 10 sources from Rishonim and Achronim. Do we have any source in Shas to substantiate this yesod? We should. And I want to suggest 4 different sources, 4 different possible sources from Shas Bavli and Yerushalmi, 3 from the Bavli, and number 4 would be the Yerushalmi. Nidas Samach Vav Amud Aleph. Benois Yisrael echmiru al atzmon afile royes tipos dam kechardel. They sit shivanakiyim. The lashon of the Gemara is echmiru al atzmon, which seems to clearly say it's not a tekonos chachamim. If it would be, Chazal would say echmiru aleim chachamim. Echmiru al atzmon. So is it only a minhag? Brachas Lamed Aleph Amud Beis. Ein oimdem lesparal ela metoch halacha psuka. And one of the examples that Chazal give to halacha psuka is what Reb Zera says. B'nois Yisrael echmiru al atzmon. Afil royes tipas dam kechardel. They sit shivanekiyim. So this might be a source of קיבלו עליהם חובה. The Rambam Perik Yud Aleph in Isurei Bia, halacha Gimel and Daled, writes at length. On one hand, he says, it's a chiyuv. It's a chiyuv l'shevet shivanakiyim al tipas dam. But on the other hand, he says, Hichmiru al atzmom, v'kach nahagu, Klal Yisrael is noyag. So, is it a chiyuv? Or is it a reshus? קיבלו al atzmom. That's the lashon of the Gemara. Hechmiru al atzmam. And the Rambam writes, Nahagu kol Yisrael. So it's a minhag, but it's a minhag that's transformed into a chiyuv. קיבלו al atzmam, hechmiru al atzmam. Source number 2, Brachas Chaf Amud Beis. Shalom malach Yeshua HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And that's a very uncommon concept in the Gemara that we find kama v'kama pa'amim. Shalom malach Yeshua HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Asher lo yisaponim v'lo yikach shoichad. And you do our noisaponim. In Bechaz Kohanim, Yisro Hashem ponav elecha. Kadosh Baruch Hu responds to the malachim. V'chi eich lo yesel am ponav Yisrael shani amartu v'chalto v'savoto uverachto v'hem edakte kon atzmam ad kezayis v'ad kebeitze. So they go above and beyond the call of duty in my service, and therefore I do the same. I respond midah keneged midah. Is this a chiyuv or a minhag? The lashon of the Gemara is v'hei medaktekim al atzmam. Must be a minhag. If it would be at konos chachamim, why do Chazal choose 1 out of 1,000 tekonos? The kona that they bench, even though they only had a kazayas. There are so many other tkonas chachamim. The lashon of the Gemara is, hey medaktekim al atzmam. And I say, it's a minhag. However, it's a minhag that Klal Yisrael took upon itself. And for thousands of years, hundreds of thousands of Jews bench even though they did not eat kedei sviyah. So on one hand, yes, medaktekim al atzmam, קיבלו עליהם חובה, becomes a chiyuv. Regarding the Gemara I just quoted, Brachas Chaf Amud Beis, I strongly suggest, look it up, Zmiras Shabbos Minchas Osher. I think of all the Svarim I wrote and published, which are more than 30 Svarim, Baruch Hashem, the Zmiras is the least known. Those that have it enjoy it a lot. It's a beautiful sefer. Minchas Osher, Zmiras Shabbos. Second part of the sefer is Lamdas on Halacha, regarding Not Malachas Shabbos, but rather everything that has to do with the Suda, with his midas. Starting off Berchas Abonim, Adlokas Ner Shabbos, Kiddush V'Havdola, Oinik Shabbos, Simchas Yom Tov. In Berchas Hamazon, on the Perik B'Morim Yalamdu, there's a nifrodike pshat in the Gemara, Medaktikam al Atzmon. I suggest you look it up. It's a wonderful sefer, this midas. So these might be two possible sources. Do they have anything in common? L'chayra not. This is Berchas Hamazon, that's Elchas Nida. Shalas Teshuvas Galia Masechet, one of the great Gedolim in Lithuania, 160 years ago. He was the Rav of Navardok, Yoredei Simen Daled. He compares the two. Medaktikam al Atzmon Berchas Hamazon at Kezayis at Kebeitze b'nois Yisrael l'chmiru al Atzmon fil rois tipes dam kechardel. And he argues one could be makel by these two halachas more than other derabbanans, because these two halachas originated b'minag, even though they were transformed to halacha קיבלו עליהם חובה. Source number 3 is Dalet Soimes, Dalet Taniyos. Rosh Hashanah Yud Ches, the Gemara says. It's Konas Nevi'im. Soim Aravi, Soim Chamishit, Soim Shvivit, Soim Asiri are quoted in the Novi Zechariyahu. But the Gemara says, Bezman sheyesh malchama chayva. Bezman sheyesh shalom, reshus. Bezman she'enoi, loy malchama v'loy shalom, rotzu misanim, rotzu ein misanim. So it depends on their rotzon. Nevertheless, the two writes in Siman Tov Kuf Nun, Shulchan Aruch HaRachaim, קיבלו על עצמם, and therefore once again becomes a choive gemura. So maybe this is the source of the validity of קיבלו על עצמם, the transform reshus into choive. So none of the 10 sources quote these possible gemuras. So many times I explain, some concepts were so pushed by B'nai Rishonim, it didn't occur to them that they need to explain it. And obviously this is one of them. The last source is the Yerushalmi regarding Tumas HaMaises B'zman Hazeh. It's a machlokes in Gemara. We paskin Tumas HaMaises B'zman Hazeh is only miderabbanan and not min haTorah. And Bavli it's mashmis at Konas Chachamim. But many sources in Yerushalmi, we find the Lashon, Me'eleim קיבלו al atzmam. And this Lashon seems to indicate it was a minig that originated by the masses. Me'eleim קיבלו al atzmam. However, everybody agrees that Trumas Vayetze is a choivo, not a reshus. It's tevel derabanan, Truma derabanan. So this might be another source. Me'eleim קיבלו al atzmam. But not a Kabbalah b'torah like most other menhogim. But a Kabbalah b'torah chayva, and that Kabbalah is valid, and that might be an additional source to the validity of קיבלו עליהם chayva, even though to the best of my memory, I don't think any of the achronim that I quoted really explain it in this fashion, or quote any of these Gemaras to explain, to substantiate the yesod, the concept of קיבלו עליהם chayva. So I find today's shiur to be extremely fascinating, and it's one of the shiurim in which we try to develop an eagle's view upon many sources, and quoting those sources, trying to analyze the sources and explain, what the klolim would be. So we started off with 10 different sources in the Poskim regarding קיבלו עליהם chayva, 4 different approaches to explain how this would work, and then 4 possible sources that we find in the Bavli and the Yerushalmi that might be sources to validate and to just explain that yes, it is a very clear possibility to transform a reshus into a chayva al yedei shekiblou alehem chayva. This week, as I said in the beginning of today's shiur, we learn about Yaakov's dream. Vayevke b'makom v'yoren sham v'yachaloim Sulav mutzo arzo v'roisho megia shamaymo v'malachei Elokim oilem v'yordim boi. What is this sulam? Who are those malachim? And why do they ascend and descend on this imaginary sulam? Baraturim, in his special style of gematriyos, Baraturim says, Sulam is begematria koil, kuf vav lamed. Easy to figure out. The samach and the mem are 100. The lamed is 30. And that's the cheshbon. Sulam has a vav, koil has a vav. Sulam begematria kuf lamed vav, koil. And that means koil tefillah. And the Baraturim goes on to explain, if you're mechaven in your tefillas, then you're burning a sturdy ladder. A ladder that could be used to go up and to come down. But if your tefillah is not proper, it's not with proper kavanah, then it's a sulam ra'ua. It's a sakona. You cannot go up or down in a sulam ra'ua. And then the Baraturim goes on to say, sulam is also begematria Sinai. Sulam chosa without a vav is begematria Sinai. So the sulam of Yaakov Avinu's dream takes us back to Torah, to Har Sinai, and to Tefillah. Koil Torah and Koil Tefillah. As I mentioned last week, that's the combination. Shnei tzdodim shelo yisamed beya, shnei yesoides u'avoida. Today, achin de lo misparshen cannot be divided. That is Torah and Tefillah. The Zohar Kodesh in this week's parsha says, the sulam nishmos da adam. That's the neshama of a Jew. Mutzavartz v'roisho megia shamayim. So in Minchas Sichas Aratorah, I quoted the smak, and also some of the Rosh Chazal. Man is unique in the entirety of creation. His body is like the body of other animals, other mammals. His neshama belongs to the angels. And Nishmas Odom is like a malach min hashamayim. And the smak quotes Chazal, when HaKadosh Baruch Hu created the world. He said, what is man going to be like? His body is like the animals. His neshama is like the angels. Yes, that is what is unique about us. And the Zohar says, the sulam is nishmas soda odom. Yes. Sulam mutzavartzo. In the mud of Har Sinai, but roisho megia shamaymo. V'malachei Elokim oilem v'yordim boi. That's the Zohar. And I say that the Zohar doesn't necessarily contradict the Baraturim. Yes, the sulam is a Jewish neshama. But it is bolstered and strengthened and built by Koil Tefillah and the Koil Torah of Har Sinai. That is what the sulam is all about. An additional thought on Yankov's dream from the Baal Shem Tov, quoted in various different Sifrei HaTalmidim. So Yankov dreams about the sulam. He sees angels going up and coming down. And he awakens with a shudder, in awe. Vayira. And he says, when he wakes up from that dream, Ein Zekiyim Beis Elokim B'zeh Shar HaShamayim. So the Baal Shem Tov's interpretation is based on the Gemara Shabbos Daf Lamed Aleph. The Gemara says, Mi sheyesh lo Torah ve'en bo Yireh Shamayim, chavan al man deles ledarta v'tara ledarta avid. Person has no house, but he builds a beautiful gate, a beautiful entrance, and we say, Shoyte Shebiyolam, You have such a beautiful gate, but there's nothing on the other side of the gate. There's desert. There's wasteland. Chaval al mi she'en lo bayis ve'boneh beit sha'ar. Chaval amen dalas lidarta ve'tara lidarta ovid. So the Baal Shem Tov points out, Yiras Shamayim is the bayis. Torah is the sha'ar. Torah is the entrance, but the real thing is Yiras Shamayim. So the Baal Shem Tov wakes up in awe after witnessing in his dream heaven and earth and this huge ladder. And he sees Malachim Olam v'Yordim, and he understands that's the neshama of a person. So we take Malachim up and we bring them down. Our actions, our deeds affect the entire Bria. They affect all the Olamis. Our Olam and Olamis Elyonim. And the Malachim go up and down, affected by our deeds, by our behavior. Our neshamas are the Sulam Mutzavot Tzavaroshim Agir Shemaim. And Yaakov wakes up and he says, Ein Zev Kiyim Beis Elokim. I just found the bias. V'zeh. Everything I learned up to this moment was only Shar HaShomayim. That was the Shar. This is the bias. So that's the interpretation of the Baal Shem Tov. And it all fits together. In this beautiful psifas, in this beautiful picture, yes, the bias and the shar. The Baraturim says, Begematria koil tefillah, Begematria Sinai, which is Torah. Torah in tefillah. Torah and yira. Torah and avodas Hashem. That is the shar and the bias. But we ask, so which is the more important? Torah or Yira? Torah or Avodah? So this mushal seems to indicate Torah is the entrance. But the bias is Yira. But on that same Daf Gemara in Shabbos Lamed Aleph, we find another mushal, which seems to contradict mushal number 1. And the Gemara says, Mi sheyesh lo Torah ve'en lo Yiras Shamayim, Mashul Misha Masulo Mafteches Pnimiyos, Avalo Masulo Mafteches Chotzonios. He has the keys to the inner chamber, but he doesn't have the key to the door. He has Torah, but he has no Yiras Shamayim. So what does he have? The keys to the inner chamber, that's Torah. But if he lacks Yira, he can't open the gate. Doesn't have the keys to the gate. So we're confused. What's in and what's out? What's the gate and what's the bias? The answer is a very simple one. There is no Torah without Yira. There is no Yira without Torah. And our avodah must be a combination of the two. On one hand, Chazal teaches us a Masechet Avos, Ein ha'oretz chosed velo bor yirei chet. You cannot be a real Yirei Shamayim and avodas Oved Hashem if you're an Amoretz. On the other hand, we find in Yevomes Kuftes, Kol mi sheyesh lo Torah ve'en bo Yiras Shamayim. Kol ha'omer ein li elo Torah, af Torah ein loi. Torah without Yirah is not even Torah. Has no meaning, no significance, no importance. But there cannot be Yirah without Torah. Kol ha'omer ein li elo Torah, af Torah ein loi. Ein ha'oretz chosed velo bor yirei chet. So yes, it's a bit confusing, but that's the way it is. Mi sheyesh lo Torah ve'en bo Yiras Shamayim. Chaval haman de'es leidarta ve'tara leidarta oved. You have a gate, but you can't even open that gate because the keys to that gate are bifnim. So yes, you have Torah, you don't have Yirah. You have a gate, but you don't have the keys. So Torah and Yirah kruchim yardu min hashamayim. and they must be combined. And that is our avodah. The combination of Beis Elokim and Shar Hashomayim. Torah and Yira. Torah and avodah. Sulam. That sulam is Nishmas Ha'odam. And our deeds and our actions affect not only our neshamas, but the entirety of the Bria of creation. Because that is what is unique about human beings, about Nishmas Ha'odam, the combination of Yetzer HaTov and Yetzer Hara. And the Medrash says when HaKadosh Baruch Hu created man, Nasa Odam, he said, Ma'i chayfetz yesh ba'olam. Animals have an Yetzer Hara. They have temptations, instincts, but they don't have a Yetzer Tov. They don't have morality. The angels have a Yetzer Tov, but they have no Yetzer Hara. They have no nisyonis. They have no challenges in Yiras Hashem. I will create man, and he will have a Yetzer Tov and a Yetzer Hara. That's his neshama. That's the neshama shasulam mitzav artzu v'roisha magia shamayimo. And he will affect the entire Bria. Malach Elokim oilem v'yorodim boy. Like the Mishnah says in Perek of Masechet Avos, Litn socha tov litzadikim shemekayim in esu oilam shenivra b'asora mamoris. V'leipora min harashoim shema'abdin esu oilam. Ze boine v'ze soiso. Mekayim oilam and ma'abdei oilam. And that is all in Nishmas Ha'odam. How do we build that ladder? How do we strengthen that ladder? Koil Torah and Har Sinai, Torah and Tefillah, Beis Elokim and Shar Hashomayim. Yeratzon she'ech elkeinu v'moim. We should be able to dedicate our lives to teach Torah and to teach Yira and Ahavas Hashem. Ki zeh kol ha'odam. Esu Elokim yoru ves mitzvosav shmoyo. Ki zeh kol ha'odam. She'nizke lahagel Torah la'adiro, she'nizke lakadesh Shem Shamayim. And have a beautiful Shabbos, all of you. She'nizke b'kora b'yameinu, l'bias Moshiach tzidkeinu b'mheiro v'yameinu amen.